clear, and I know people will have lots of questions. I am now going to turn the floor over to Anne Bergmans of the University of Antwerp. There she is a lecturer and senior research fellow at the Faculty of Social Sciences and at the Faculty of Law. She holds a PhD in social sciences and a master's degree in international politics and maritime economics. Her professional interests are mainly situated in the field of science and technology studies, with particular attention to the interaction between science, society, and policy. And she's worked a lot on a number of issues associated with nuclear waste siting and observed them in Belgium and elsewhere. And so we'll call on her for her expertise to discuss, at least initially, the Belgian situation. And we'll get into a larger conversation in a moment. So Anne, I'm going to turn things over to you. Arne, if you stop sharing your screen.
Yeah, I can't come back to the, sorry.
Maybe if I do just a hostile takeover, it may work.
We'll see. Maybe you can.
No, I cannot.
Okay,
you have
cannot.
to. No, I cannot.
Maybe I have to go into the meeting again. Actually, it's sorry.
There we go. Okay, thanks, Rebecca.
She can do a hostile takeover. That's good. You always need someone like that.
Yeah. Okay. Good. I'm back. Fine.
There you go. Hope you can all see what I can see.
Yes.
So you asked me to give you some possible lessons from nuclear waste management siting, and then particularly in Belgium. This is about engagement. Your question is about engagement, public engagement, or more specific, stakeholder engagement. I would therefore like to share this very nice drawing that some cartoonist made for us for a publication on monitoring of geological disposal. Yeah, many of the things that Arne has said, I can agree with, and can also be related to Belgium, but I've picked up out a few other things, and then we can see later on in the discussion. But for this issue of engagement, the why is maybe most clear to you, because otherwise you wouldn't have asked us to come and talk about it. But the how and when and who should be involved are things that typically come back. And what should it be about? Something I also would like to touch upon. And this Arne also pointed to it, I think indirectly maybe, but this difficult balance of doing it too early or too late, or when will stakeholders come in? And my focus will be particularly on locals, so the one actually ending up being a host community for a particular facility, because they're always the ones that are most downstream of these kind of policy decisions, and there is where the trouble sometimes starts, or when it's mostly flagged. So why doing engagement has to do with acknowledging the social in these questions. That's clearly from all the questions that you have been raising in the last 2 days. And in our experience with nuclear waste management, this social is often neglected until siting starts, because then it's when the marbles start rolling and when things become concrete, and that's, I think, goes also for other industries and other facility siting issues. And then the social is in that respect often kind of reduced to emotional reactions in a very negative, with a negative connotation of people being irrationally scared of things, or not knowledgeable enough to make an informed decision that would inevitably be positive towards the facility, or in terms of conflicts of interest between the general interest, which is pro the facility siting, and the local or individual interests which go against that. So it's siting when shit hits the fan often enough, to name names. And it's not just the thing with nuclear waste or nuclear energy, it's just the same problem with wind power. And that's why I like to show you this, this nice drawing. So it's when all these ideal locations and perfectly designed or pre-thought project plans are questioned by all these NIMBY conspirators. So a thing I think we can learn from nuclear waste management is that we should try to avoid this siting trap. And we should think more about turning around the prevailing planning logic, which is quite hierarchical in terms of, well, developing a policy and deciding on which type of energy production is the most preferred, or we need so much percentage of nuclear and we need so much percentage of something else, and we'll distribute that, and then we do some allocation planning, so vast areas in which things could be possible and not possible, and then we move on to concrete location, and then you have a problem because then you meet the neighbors. So in waste management, not explicitly, but we have sort of found ways of coupling these issues again, because they're often decoupled. And as Arne showed clearly, in Sweden, there was this problem with virgin territory where demonstrations were held because they were chosen on a theoretical basis or a theoretical model for being an ideal location. So what we in Belgium did and what the Swedes did is we turned this around and we started where the waste was already, because that's the advantage, if you can call it like that, with nuclear waste. It's already out there, it's already somewhere, or it's already being produced somewhere. So it's something that's physically already there, which is obviously different from the issue of siting a new industrial complex or a new waste production site, energy production facility, my apologies. And in Belgium, slightly more explicitly, I think, than in Sweden, but something that's been picked up by the Swiss, not only because they came and saw that we were doing that, but also because their program pointed them to that kind of solution. It is to combine the investigation of how and where. And particularly in Belgium, when we, the case that I'm talking about is low and intermediate level surface repository, eventually it turned out to be. But we have exactly the same, or we had exactly the same problems in the early 1990s as Sweden had for the high level waste or for the spent fuel. My country is a very densely populated country, so it's very difficult to find people who live further out or than 500 meters from a facility. And in the case of the facility that I'm talking about, it's actually kind of 450 meters or 300 meters before you meet the first neighbors. So it's a complex problem. There's many people on a very small part of ground. Anyway, so we had more or less the same problems as Arne described, looking for the ideal place. And then when this was turned around at the end of the 1990s, government actually asked NARA-ZONDREF, which is our nuclear waste management agency, to do an investigation on what would be the best solution for final disposal of that waste. They should look into surface disposal, geological disposal, anything in between. But it was made clear also that they needed to do that in relation to a particular location, and in that process consult the local community. So we coupled location and project together. And an important thing that is part of that, and I think in Belgian case it's probably the most explicit, that we try to leave options beyond just saying yes or no. We can talk about that a little further afterwards. I'm not going to take up too much time now. Another issue of acknowledging the social, which I think is important, is that it's not only about the soft issues or these selfish interests, but it can also be about very technical things, which turned out to be the case in Belgium. And related to that, the technical is also always something that's always also inherently social to some extent. But I assume that the people in panel 3 yesterday morning will have talked about that a lot. So I'm not going to go into too much detail there. And on top of that also, it's not only a question of engagement. I'm saying that because I've, in my experience, over 20 years now, with these questions, as a social scientist or an STS scholar, you're often asked to come into a project or to talk to implementers from the perspective of helping them out with organizing engagement. And I think that, well, plenty of the things that have been on the agenda of this workshop, so good points there, I think, is that it's clear that it's not just that. We can develop insights into what these social things are, and particularly also uncan the technical or unbox the technical black box, and help put issues on top of mind, for example, and not necessarily in relation to facilitating or setting up directly an engagement process. And some good examples of where this has been done, I think that I'd hoped Saida would have would be able to be here to talk about that. She was instrumental in that in Sweden, I think, 2 decades ago, maybe already, in starting up a specific dedicated social sciences program to not just have a technical focus. And Saida was also helpful in convincing the French agency ANVRA to do that. But that aside, when it does come to engagement, because that's what you've asked me to talk about, important elements there are the issue of co-creation and partnership, although I do have a feeling that partnership sometimes has been understood as something dodgy or just make people accomplices, and that's not the idea that was behind how we used it and how we called our engagement program local partnerships. The notion behind there is that we move, or we try to move the people from being stakeholders to shareholders, to own the solution, but before that, to become or get ownership of the problem. And that is a particularly important thing. I think that often particularly in the case of nuclear waste, implementers, nuclear waste management agencies, they've been studying this problem for such a long time, been thinking about it for such a long time, and they really, with the best interest in mind, are convinced of their solution and are looking for ways of implementing that. So they always come with, we have something here for you, which is fantastic, and it's the solution to all your problems. And then people ask, what problem? I'm not aware of that, I don't know. So starting from the problem, owning the problem, what is it we're going to do together is important. And obviously, yeah, the easy way in that we had and that SKB had, Östhammar and Oskarshamn, is that they already owned the problem, because if nobody else wants that waste, then those communities are stuck with it anyway. So it's in their own interest to try and find other solutions. An important element, so these things I think are similar. Sweden, Belgium, Switzerland I've mentioned before, and others. What is slightly more particular in our case is that maybe not explicitly from the start, but it's something that I've observed being allowed more and more, or helping to some extent discussions and moving on, is that there's been a lot of flexibility from either side, and that we managed in the project to some extent to foster complexity, to not make it simple or reductionist, or to keep things open, and to acknowledge that it's complex and that there are many angles to it. And by acknowledging that, and by not saying it's basically simple, we're just going to come here and build this and that's done, you allow for multiple ways of looking at it, multiple ways of caring for that problem, of caring, thinking about caring for the waste. It leaves you room for negotiation and renegotiation at certain points as well, because the process here has been going on for quite a long time. And that's often, I often get a reaction, particularly from people with a more technical background, let's say. Safety is not open for negotiation. The regulator tells you what to do and that's it. And we'll do the numbers and they'll tell you what to do, and the safety case is holy, and there's no way of negotiating around that. And particularly when we started the project, people from the Belgian Waste Management Agency were actually scared that people would want to redesign things in ways that was absolutely unsafe. Now the people have put forward from the beginning that safety is absolutely their priority, and so they do agree on that, but they're not always agree on what exactly safety is, and I'll come back to that on the next slide. The thing about multiple rationalities has to do with just multiple ways of looking at it. It is that we actually, by continuously reassessing the project and sort of saying this is okay, but this is still open, and here we don't agree yet, allowed actually to develop in a progressive way, and to allow for different views on how to proceed, also to work together in ways that we would have thought beforehand would not really be possible. And an element that helped there also was that when looking at project development, it wasn't just only on hard criteria such as timing and scope and budget, and actually to a large extent in our case that was definitely not the first or the main issues, but during the process a number of actually qualitative performance criteria, and something went wrong there in the slide. My apologies that one X is not in the right place, but sort of qualitative performance criteria were developed, and those had to do with safety and well-being of the community, with transparency in the decision making, but also with a willingness to adapt from the agency to keep everybody on board, because we were also dealing with 2 municipalities with quite a different structure and different expectations, apologies. And also ways of trying to find mechanisms to guarantee funding throughout, by working with envelope financing rather than exact tight budgets. But that obviously is also because it's a project that will last for quite a long time, and it's still not, still hasn't really started fully, and we're 20 years on in the program. But still, it's a success in some ways. An important lesson, I'll come back to that also, is it's not just engage with local people, it's also engaging with the regulator, or engage the regulator, and Arne also referred to that as an important player, and other relevant institutional stakeholders. Because if one thing was an important challenge and a problem in the Belgian situation, is that the whole story of the partnerships really from the beginning onward was very much an implementer local community issue, which I think is in Sweden also to some extent the case, and how it started. But our regulator did not want to participate, did not want to intervene, did not want to come talk to local people because they had really considered themselves, or they really had a very classical view on evaluating safety, and it was their role to do that, and they should not be involved in the development of a project. They needed to be neutral, and I can fully understand that. But that meant that the local people and the implementer went through a long process of redesigning and rethinking a facility, and then the regulator, simply based on a particular view that they had, said, well, it doesn't work, and then everybody had to start all over again. Not all over again. Eventually the regulator came into the negotiations, but with some backlash. So I mean that will have taken a couple of years from the process. Anyway, so I did the last point first, so I can do the ones before that now. So very specific experience from Belgium, which I think is something that you could learn from and maybe take away, is that we allowed the host community to, and it ended up being two communities, two municipalities, set up their conditions, and they came up with the obvious community benefits, which are well studied in this nuclear waste siting question. It's kind of it's been going on for it's been there's been a change over the last 2 decades also in there, but it seems to be part of the deal everywhere now. So that's not that specific, and you could have anticipated that. Very strong insistence also on looking at the future management of the site and anything to do with governance, information sharing, consultation, and particularly participation was insisted upon. Also something that you find, maybe not in that much detail, but in many other countries. But the one thing that I think that we were most particular in is that quite some specific technical aspects and technical criteria or conditions related to the repository concept itself were put forward by the local community, by the people debating and discussing the project with the implementer. And this had to do with safety and security issues, with public health and the environment. So what you see on the left hand there in the middle is the last, it's not a picture, it's the last very fancy design, which looks like it's actually already there, but we still haven't started, or they still haven't started, but that is what it's going to look like once the license is approved, assumably. And a number of elements there were added by the local community. We have a fixed roof, for example, which was not in the early design, and the roof, the idea of the roof came after people had visited Soulaine in France, where there was not a fixed roof and where they saw that everything was wet inside, and they came back to the regulator, to the implementer, and they said, well, you've been talking about water as a very negative thing that you want to avoid. It rains a lot here, so please make sure that you have a cover that is there all the time and not just passing through when waste disposal units are passing through. The layout of the site was quite a big impact from the local community on that. They really made the engineers and designers save tremendous amounts of space by reorganizing things. There is the issue of transport over waterways, which was something that nobody had thought about before. The number of prototypes, which you will see on the top there, it has to do with demonstration tests, subsidence test, and actually also a test cover, because one of the first meetings that I also participated in, the engineers from ONDREF came with a very nice picture or drawing of a lovely green hill, which was the repository as it was built and how it would look like. and then somebody in the room at the end of the meeting, or maybe it was the next meeting, but I think it was towards the end of that first meeting, realized that that picture would not be there before 100 years. So they said, well, come back with some other pictures next time around, because not even my grandchildren will see that. And so then they decided also not to talk about what kind of grass they would grow on that heap. But they said, we'll have time. We put up some tests and to check actually what would be good to grow there and how it could actually be developed. Obviously, the engineers from ONDREF also think that they were the ones who came up with this, but when we talked to the local people after the plans were developed and the community agreed to host this facility under certain conditions, when we checked them, 75% of the local people who participated in the project responded to us that they thought that they influenced the repository design massively, while the engineers that we talked to were very happy because people went along with about 95% of what they had suggested them. So everybody happy, I would say. Another, one last thing is something I promised Alison to talk about. It's the story of the basement. That's where you see the red arrow. That is something underneath the facility. Actually, I've talked about water before, fertile water and rain, but that area is also, the groundwater level is quite high in that area, which was one of the reasons why initially ONDREF did not consider this to be a good place to put the waste. It was actually excluded from the first list of theoretically interesting places to put a surface repository. And so they came up with the suggestion of a 2-meter high elevation. The engineers came up with that solution to make sure that the facility was high above the ground. But then also after visiting Soulaine and some other facilities, and particularly Soulaine, the people in the local working groups discussing this started questioning the idea of measuring a bit outside of the facility remit in the local in a local stream, whether or not anything radioactive would be leaking from the facility, which was the way it was done in France, or at least how they understood it was done in France. And so they said, well, we don't, obviously the principle is containment here, but in case something goes wrong, then the idea was we need this dilute and disperse. And so they said, we don't want that because there's high groundwater levels here, and we are the freshwater basin level, we are the freshwater reservoir for the whole of the Flanders region. So if anything goes wrong here, then everybody has a problem. So they said we also want containment, and we want actually kind of a basement structure there to use for monitoring whether there's water flowing or not, and also as a drip tray. So if anything bad flows down, we can capture it there, collect, and make sure that we treat it well. Initially, the idea was actually to have a cave in which a person could walk and check, and that was rejected by the regulator, and there was a lot of negotiations, and we ended up now with this, which is part of the design that's been approved by the regulator, or at least that the regulator does not have any more questions about. And it's been lowered, and it's now something that a robot will be designed to work on that. But this is yeah, for me, a very clear example of how, yeah, people actually, from that social perspective, from that local perspective, got into very detailed technical debate and discussions, and actually putting forward a number of options, because other options had been offered and thought about before. And the picture with the the people there, and yes, it's all men, I think, and some of them a bit older. But these are four of the 7 people there are participants in the local partnership. They come and see what is going on with this demonstration site. It's pouring of concrete into these things. So the people are engaged, and many of these local people are, several of these local people are people with a technical interest, with an engineering background, but maybe not in nuclear waste, but they also get very excited from doing these things and thinking about this. And the last one, I'm not going to go into more detail on that. I've talked a little bit about that in terms of the being flexible structure and these multiple rationalities. It's by setting up an extended project management. So the project management committee for this particular project does not only consists of people from ONDRAF, but also people from the local partnerships, so people from local civil society, and also the 2 mayors of the mayor of each of the 2 municipalities involved. And I don't think they've ever voted, but they discuss kind of every new step in the process, and they usually try and get consensus. And if one of the municipalities or one of the partnerships does not agree or doesn't feel too well about it, then they go back and renegotiate and see. And it's been a long process, but not mainly for that reason. I think that the fact that the regulator came in quite late and has a very different view on things, in particular also in first said, well, this is not the ideal site, so we shouldn't build it there. That really slowed down the process ever more, I think, than the being flexible and making sure that everybody is on board. So I don't then mean that you need to manipulate the regulator, but I think the regulator should also be recognize this social aspect and be engaged in thinking about what that means and how that could be forwarded. So not just something for an implementer to do by himself. That was basically what I wanted to share with you today. And I hope that this will lead to some questions that can help me think about sharing other things that could be of use and of value. Thank you for your attention.
Great, thanks so much, Anne.
Stop scrolling, it's sharing now.
Yeah, that's good.